Hello, my name is Patrick Usher, and in this video I wish to discuss the link between fibromyalgia and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS. Now this is important because many people with POTS also have fibromyalgia, and many people with fibromyalgia also have POTS. Now, of course, and sometimes people in these groups do not actually know that they have the other condition, and that's particularly true when someone might have fibromyalgia and also POTS, so they might not actually know that they have POTS as well, because POTS tends to be lesser known currently, although that's changing. But in any event, so people often have both and many other conditions besides, and the question I want to pose, in case you're wondering why, is, well, why is that? And this is relevant to my own story, because if I think back to when I was sick, I didn't just have POTS, I also was chemically sensitive, and I was exhausted, so you could say I had chronic fatigue syndrome, although of course chronic fatigue syndrome has much more going on than just exhaustion, and I was in a lot of pain, so to put my feet on the floor was painful. My limbs ached and were in pain constantly. So in that sense, one could say I had fibromyalgia. Now, but when I think back to when I was sick, I had this mindset that I had all of these different conditions, that I was sick with fibromyalgia, and that was one thing, and I was sick with POTS, and that was another, and I might recover from one, but I might be still stuck with the other 8, that kind of, well, I didn't have 8 other things, but some people do, but that you might recover from one but still be stuck with the others, and because we have this mentality that these are all separate conditions. And in a way they are all separate conditions, but they all stem, I believe, from limbic system impairment, from an impairment in the flight or fight centres of the brain. And of course, as with anything I say as regards this is an hypothesis, it's not necessarily true, and I recognise that there may be errors and so forth, but I strongly believe, having researched this question, that all of these conditions are limbic system impairments. And what may result in why one person ends up with fibromyalgia predominantly, or POTS predominantly, and then others in a kind of more minor way, or even it could end up that one has all of these conditions equally. But in any event, it's really a question of which parts of the limbic system are primarily adversely affected, I think, because one says the flight or fight centres of the brain, but actually there are a lot of different aspects to the flight or fight centres of the brain. And so some of them may end up being in greater trauma than others, and that may explain why certain kinds of limbic system impairment will predominate in that individual. So I'm going to do a little series of videos which considers the link between POTS and other limbic system impairments. And I want to start with fibromyalgia. So, but before I get there, I just want to give you an example of someone who had very severe limbic system impairment. This is a case study in Annie Hopper's book, Wired for Healing, Remapping the Brain to Recover from Chronic and Mysterious Illnesses, which was published in 2015. And it's a very, very handy book. I plan to do a review of it at some point, actually, on this channel. But she has a range of case studies of people who've used the dynamic neural retraining system to recover from limbic system impairment. And one of them, Jessica, whom I met actually in Los Angeles recently when I was there. Jessica had POTS, but she didn't just have POTS, and I'm going to read to you the list of conditions she had, so that you can get a sense that when you have a limbic system impairment, you don't just have one condition as it is labelled in a standard way, by medical researchers who tend to label all these things differently. And they're right, they are all different, but they all stem, I believe, from the limbic system impairment idea. Okay, so Jessica, this is the list. It's in the chapter entitled "At the End of Her Rope and Praying for a Miracle." So Jessica, over the years, she was diagnosed with the following conditions: unidentified autoimmune syndrome, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, premature ventricular contractions, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, mold biotoxin illness, extreme multiple chemical sensitivities, environmental illness, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic pain syndrome, genetic detoxification inefficiency gene, chronic migraines, electric hypersensitivity syndrome, heavy metal toxicity, and food sensitivities. She also experienced the associated depression, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive behaviours that often accompany these conditions. Go figure. No surprise there. So you have all those things and you're depressed. Gosh. Anyway, so the thing is, though, so not all of those conditions are that I listed there would be limbic system impairment, but most of them were. And so it's just to give you a sense that actually you may be watching this and feel that you have 10 separate things, but actually they may all have a very similar root, and if you can target the root, then all of the branches may heal up. And so now to discuss fibromyalgia in particular and its link to POTS, and why it is that I believe that fibromyalgia is also a limbic system impairment. Now, fibromyalgia, which literally means muscle pain, is probably one of the more widely recognised limbic system impairments, probably one of the more widely researched, even though it hasn't been researched enough. It's a term that certainly if you say to a lot of people, in the general population that such and such has fibromyalgia, they're likely to think, oh yeah, I've heard of that. So it's kind of more widely known than with POTS, and certainly in my experience with POTS, I'd say about 1 in 20 people may have heard of it. It's or even fewer. Whereas fibromyalgia is more commonly kind of known about. And the reason it is also a limbic system impairment, I believe, is because the limbic system also processes our sense of pain. So the part of the brain that does that is the cingulate cortex, and in the limbic system. And so when you stub your toe and you get that sensation of pain, that's the cingulate cortex going, firing off in the limbic system and saying, that hurts, don't do that again, or stop stubbing your toe, or whatever, get your foot away from there. So that's a kind of very primitive and direct sensation of pain, and it is felt by that part of the brain. Now that's fine under normal circumstances. It serves a very important function. You want that to be the case because you don't want to stub your toe. You don't want to burn yourself. You don't want to so many things. Okay. But under abnormal circumstances, when the limbic system enters a chronic state of crisis, the ideas I'm trying to put forward, and which Annie Hopper puts forward in her book Wired for Healing and in her program, is that the cingulate cortex and its ability to perceive pain will also enter a state of crisis. So in other words, it enters a hypervigilant state. And so what this means is that your sensory perception of pain becomes heightened, and actually a lot of things become and are felt as painful that before would not have been painful. And of course, you may say, well, are you saying this is all in your head? No, of course not. This is actually a very physical impairment to that part of the brain which processes pain, and when it goes wrong, you feel everything is in pain, and because those mechanisms which control pain perception are what allow this to happen in the first place, and when they enter into crisis, you are actually in pain everywhere. The mind and body are one. So you are in a total state of pain, and this is also, the researchers know this already, this is well known. What's called classic fibromyalgia is a state of, it's recognized a state of pain perception problems, okay? And so someone with fibromyalgia is not just like, as I had, which was fairly bad in terms of feet on the floor, achy and painful limbs, but actually it can be painful, everything's painful. You're lying on a bed, it's painful. You are touching something, it's painful. particularly worse at night. You're lying in bed at night, and for whatever reason, the pain centers in the brain are more sensitive at night, and so you feel greater pain. People with fibromyalgia often complain of being unable to sleep at all because of the pain, right? So it is because the limbic system has entered a hypervigilant state, and its pain centers are accordingly heightened as well. Now, I remember back to when I had POTS and a lot of this pain, that I started the dynamic neural retraining system in May 2015, and I would say that it was about 3 or 4 weeks, I think it was 3 weeks later, that I got up in the morning, I put my feet on the floor, and there was no pain in my feet. That was an amazing moment, because up until that point, in the time I'd been unwell, it was painful to put my feet on the floor, and that suddenly disappeared. So my point in saying this is that if you start to dampen that stress response in the limbic system, if you calm the hypervigilance down, then it accordingly makes sense that at some stage along the line, your cingulate cortex and its sensitivity to the perception of pain will also dampen down. And when that dampens down, you should start to perceive things as normal again. So I hope this video has been helpful. I've tried to spell out the link between fibromyalgia and POTS, just as POTS is also a form of limbic system impairment, which involves different parts of the limbic system going into crisis primarily, but it stands to reason that you're not going to have most likely one part of the limbic system affected and not the other. They all relate to each other, they're all working together. So one area of crisis will lead to the other area of crisis, and so the cingulate cortex will become also hypersensitive, and that means that your perception of pain will be profoundly changed, such that a lot of things that should not appear painful will actually be felt as painful, and they are painful. Because the brain and the body are one, and you can't feel without the brain's role in the perception of that feeling. And when the brain enters crisis and the pain perception centers into crisis, that affects how you feel everything, and that is very, very real and very physical, unless you think that the brain isn't a physical organ, in which case, good luck to you. So that's what I want to say about that, and I wish you a pleasant day wherever you are, and I hope you find that helpful. If you have fibromyalgia and POTS together, or you have POTS with undiagnosed muscle pain, do comment below, do discuss your experience for other people, and see if this makes sense to you, or if you have any other additional points you would like to make from your own reading. They're all very welcome.